Welcome back. This is part 6 of investigating the 70 weeks prophecy found in the Book of Daniel. We have gone through the entire prophecy at this point, and it might seem like that is the end of the topic. However, as you'll see, there's more to be investigated. Let's begin by taking a look at this passage from the Bible. In Deuteronomy 19:15, God states the law that a single witness shall not suffice against a person for any crime or for any wrong in connection with any offense that he has committed. Only on the evidence of 2 witnesses or of 3 witnesses shall a charge be established. God used prophets throughout the history of Israel to make known his will, his displeasure, and his warnings of impending judgments. Sometimes the king and the population heeded the words, such as with King Josiah, but often the prophets were ignored, or even worse, were thrown in prison and killed. In the investigation of the 70 weeks given through Gabriel, we have examined the history circa 600 BC, at the time of the rise of the Babylonian Empire. During this period, God used 3 specific prophets, which would have a major impact on the future of the people of Israel. They were Jeremiah, Daniel, and Ezekiel. We have seen that Jeremiah's prophecies contained the prophecy that the empire of Babylon would last 70 years and no longer. Daniel read and understood this information, and this was the catalyst for his prayer and God's answer in chapter 9 of Daniel. Gabriel showed Daniel a further period of 70, this time 70 weeks of years, that were again tied to the prophecies contained in Jeremiah. God specifically promised that he would allow the Jewish people to return and to rebuild Jerusalem and the temple. However, in addition, one of the purposes of the 70 weeks is to atone for iniquity. You find that in Daniel 9:24. The people of Israel had gone against God's laws and now were under a period of judgment. But as God states in Deuteronomy 19, a single witness by a single prophet is not good enough to charge for wrongdoing. This is where Ezekiel enters the picture. He is the second witness that God uses to indict the people of Israel. The object lesson which we will investigate, that Ezekiel demonstrates, shows a period of time of God's judgment. But it has been shrouded in much mystery, and many people do not know how to interpret it correctly. All sorts of crazy theories have been put forward, just like the 70 weeks in Daniel. However, just as we have seen with the proper interpretation of the 70 weeks, one must consider the history of the time period. The Bible does not make things impossible to figure out, but it does take much study and effort. As we'll see, the 2 witnesses of Daniel and Ezekiel lay out the exact same period of judgment for the people of Israel. But before we look at what Ezekiel did, we need to familiarize ourselves with more of the history of Judah during this time period. In 609 BC, King Josiah of Judah felt threatened as the Egyptian army marched past his territory on their way to engage the Babylonians at Carchemish. Josiah decided to attack, but he was killed by an Egyptian archer. You find this in 2 Chronicles 35:20-24. After all this, when Josiah had prepared the temple, Necho, king of Egypt, went up to fight at Carchemish on the Euphrates, and Josiah went out to meet him. But he sent envoys to him, saying, "What have we to do with each other, king of Judah? I am not coming against you this day, but against the house with which I am at war. And God commanded me to hurry. Cease opposing God, who is with me, lest he destroy you." Nevertheless, Josiah did not turn away from him, but disguised himself in order to fight with him. He did not listen to the words of Necho from the mouth of God, but came to fight in the plain of Megiddo, and the archers shot King Josiah. The Egyptians continued on, but were beaten back, and during their retreat they conquered Judah and turned it into a vassal state. Judah and the surrounding area were under the judgment of God, as Babylon was now the dominant power in the region. 2 Chronicles 34, 22-28. 3 times throughout Jeremiah's writings, God refers to Nebuchadnezzar as my servant. Jeremiah 25:9, 27:6, and 43:10. The pagan king, along with his Babylonian empire, were being used by God for his special purposes. Judah's next king, Jehoiakim, was warned to accept this time of God's discipline. In 605 BC, Jeremiah wrote his entire career of prophecies on a scroll and had them read in the temple. It caused such a stir that Jehoiakim wanted to hear it all for himself. And the king was sitting in the winter house, and there was a fire burning in the firepot before him. As Yehudi read 3 or 4 columns, the king would cut them off with a knife and throw them into the fire in the firepot, until the entire scroll was consumed in the fire that was in the firepot. Yet neither the king nor any of his servants who heard all these words was afraid, nor did they tear their garments. Jeremiah 35:22-24. The prophecies that he read from Jeremiah were quite specific. Because you have not obeyed my words, behold, I will send for all the tribes of the north, declares the Lord, and for Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant. And I will bring them against this land and its inhabitants, and against all the surrounding nations. Jeremiah 25:8 verse 9, or 8 and 9. So I took the cup from the Lord's hand, and made all the nations to whom the Lord sent me drink it. Jerusalem and the cities of Judah, its kings and officials, to make them a desolation and a waste. Jeremiah 25:17-18. And if they refuse to accept the cup from your hand to drink, then you shall say to them, Thus says the Lord of hosts, you must drink. Jeremiah 25:28. That very year, in 605, Nebuchadnezzar conquered Judah, made them pay tribute to him, and carted off some of the prized temple artifacts. You find this in 2 Chronicles 35:6 and 7. Went along with this arrangement for 3 years, but then he rebelled. In his days, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up, and Jehoiakim became his servant for 3 years. Then he turned and rebelled against him, and the Lord sent against him bands of the Chaldeans, and bands of the Syrians, and bands of the Moabites, and bands of the Ammonites, and sent them against Judah to destroy it, according to the word of the Lord that he spoke by his servants the prophets. Surely this came upon Judah at the command of the Lord, to remove them out of his sight, for the sins of Manasseh, according to all that he had done, and also for the innocent blood that he had shed. For he filled Jerusalem with innocent blood, and the Lord would not pardon. 2 Kings 24:1-4. This rebellion against the judgment of God marked the start of the further prophesied judgments that Jeremiah had spoken of. By 597 BC, Jehoiakim had been killed, and Jehoiachin, his son, along with 10,000 others, were deported to Babylon, and Zedekiah was made ruler in Jerusalem. Jeremiah again warned the people that they needed to accept this allotted time of judgment. Jeremiah 27 is a prophecy given at the beginning of the reign of Zedekiah. Now I have given all these lands into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant, and I have given him also the beasts of the field to serve him. All the nations shall serve him and his son and his grandson until the time of his own land comes. Then many nations and great kings shall make him their slave. But if any nation or kingdom will not serve this Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and put its neck under the yoke of the king of Babylon, I will punish that nation with the sword, with famine, and with pestilence, declares the Lord, until I have consumed it by his hand. Jeremiah 27, 6-8. To Zedekiah, king of Judah, I spoke in like manner. Bring your necks under the yoke of the king of Babylon, and serve him and his people, and live. Why will you and your people die by the sword, by famine, and by pestilence, as the Lord has spoken concerning any nation that will not serve the king of Babylon? Do not listen to the words of the prophets who are saying to you, you shall not serve the king of Babylon, for it is a lie that they are prophesying to you. I have not sent them, declares the Lord, but they are prophesying falsely in my name, with the result that I will drive you out and you will perish, you and the prophets who are prophesying to you. Jeremiah 27, 12-15. King Zedekiah was not happy about hearing this type of message. There were plenty of other prophets who told him what he wanted to hear instead. But they were proven not to be speaking for the true God. For example, Hananiah prophesied that within 2 years, the period of judgment on the nations by Babylon would be over. Jeremiah informed him that he would die because of his false predictions. It turned out that he didn't even last the 2 years to see his prophecy was wrong. He died 2 months later. However, Zedekiah did not submit, and their rebellion was even worse. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord his God. He did not humble himself before Jeremiah the prophet, who spoke from the mouth of the Lord. He also rebelled against King Nebuchadnezzar, who had made him swear by God. He stiffened his neck and hardened his heart against turning to the Lord, the God of Israel. All the officers of the priests and the people likewise were exceedingly unfaithful, following all the abominations of the nations, and they polluted the house of the Lord that he had made holy in Jerusalem. 2 Chronicles 36, 12-14. Nebuchadnezzar returned once again and set up a multi-year siege against Jerusalem, which resulted in horrific deaths and suffering. The city fell in 586 BC, and the remaining majority of the population was deported to Babylon. Meanwhile, the prophet Ezekiel was living in exile in Babylon after the deportation of Jehoiachin in 597 BC. You find this in Ezekiel 1 verse 2. In 593 BC, God gave him a strange set of activities to perform as an object lesson. And you, son of man, take a brick and lay it before you, and engrave on it a city, even Jerusalem, and put siege works against it, and build a siege wall against it, and cast up a mound against it. Set camps also against it, and plant battering rams against it all around. And you, take an iron griddle, and place it as an iron wall between you and the city, and set your face toward it, and let it be in a state of siege. And press the siege against it. This is a sign for the house of Israel. Then lie on your left side, and place the punishment of the house of Israel upon it. For the number of the days that you lie on it, you shall bear their punishment. For I assign you a number of days, 390 days, equal to the number of the years of their punishment. So long shall you bear the punishment of the house of Israel. And when you have completed these, you shall lie down a second time, but on your right side, and bear the punishment of the house of Judah. 40 days I assign to you, a day for each year. And you shall set your face toward the siege of Jerusalem, with your arm bared, and you shall prophesy against the city. And behold, I will place cords upon you, so that you cannot turn from one side to the other, till you have completed the days of your siege. Ezekiel 4, 1-8. The object lesson was for both the house of Israel and the house of Judah. It is stated twice in the passage that the number of days represent the number of years. 390 years for Israel and 40 years for Judah. a total number of 430 years. It is stated multiple times that this represents the years of their punishment. Let's start by determining the exact dates. There are very specific dates given through Ezekiel's entire narrative in chapters 1 through 10. The first date is when Ezekiel's initial vision took place, preparing him for his prophetic ministry. It was the 5th year of exile of Jehoiachin, the 4th month and the 5th day. That's in Ezekiel 1, 1-2. Using the Babylonian chronology, the exact date can be determined. This date also matches the calendar based on the ripeness of the barley in Israel. That is, the state of Aviv. So whether you consider Ezekiel using the Babylonian calendar or using the calendar in Judah, the dates calculated for this year match exactly. So it was Tammuz the 5th on Saturday, July 1st, 593 BC. Now this is Julian date 1505011.5. Now a Julian date is not the same as the Julian calendar. It is a system of assigning a number to a specific date in history, so that no matter what kind of calendar is used, it can be converted back and forth. It allows for very easy calendar math. So Ezekiel then spends the next 7 days recovering, and on the 8th day he begins the object lesson prophecy of the 430 days. This is found in Ezekiel 3 verse 16, which is Tammuz the 13th on Sunday, July 9th, 593 BC, and that particular Julian date. The first period is 390 days for the house of Israel. So that year included an intercalation, and Nisan the 1st occurred on April 19th, 592 BC. The end of the 390 days occurs on Tammuz the 19th, which is Friday, August 3rd, 592 BC. The next period was 40 days for the house of Judah, and that was the total end of the entire 430 days. And that was on Elul the 1st, which was Thursday, September 13th, 592 BC. So chapter 8 lists the next specific date as Ezekiel is supernaturally transported to Jerusalem. He witnesses another Passover where the idolaters who haven't been marked on their foreheads are killed, and the glory of the Lord departs from the temple. Now this was in the 6th year of Jehoiachin's exile, the 6th month and the 5th day. And this works out to Elul the 5th, which is Monday, September 17th, 592 BC, in that particular Julian date. So that year of 592 BC contained 2 solar eclipse event signs. Now these are eclipses that coincided with the feast days of April 17th, 592 and October 10th, 592. This grouping of eclipses consisted solely of solar eclipses, which seems to signify an especially important judgment from God. Both the end of the 430-day prophecy and the glory departing from the temple occurred within this year. Now that we have determined the exact dates for specific anchor points, we can now move on to some results. The first interesting thing that emerges is that these dates prove the calendar was intercalated. That is, it used a leap month during this time. Ezekiel begins his object lesson on Tammuz the 13th. The next specific date given in his narrative is Elul the 5th in the following year. We know that at least 430 days have to be between these days. After all, 430 days was the whole point of his object lesson. Tammuz is the 4th month of the year. Elul is the 6th month. In a regular Jewish lunar year, there would be 14 months between those dates. A month alternates between 29 and 30 full days. On average, this is 29 and a half days. So 14 months times 29 and a half days equals 413 days. A regular year only provides about 413 days between those particular dates. That is well short of the 430 days that Ezekiel actually spent during that time. This means that an extra leap month occurred early in that year, which added an additional 30 days. This shows that the Luni-Solar calendar was in operation and was using the Metonic cycle in order to keep the lunar months aligned with the solar seasons. The year that Ezekiel describes was not a usual lunar year of 354 days. Instead, it needed an additional leap month, which made that year 384 days long. Now let's move on how to interpret this 430-day object lesson. First, the stated purpose of the 390 days for Israel and the 40 days for Judah is the same. The periods are equal to the number of years of their punishment. That's Ezekiel 4 verse 5. God had determined that the remaining Jewish nation and the surrounding nations would be under a period of 70 years of discipline starting in 609 BC, in which he used Babylon as his agent. Jehoiakim and Judah rebelled against this required discipline in 602 BC, after only 7 years. The 430 year for a day time of prophesied judgment, demonstrated by Ezekiel, began at this point a rebellion against God. However, even after they started to experience the judgments for rebellion, which Jeremiah had prophesied, Zedekiah, along with the rest of Judah, continued to rebel against God. So God put into effect his rule of judgment found in Leviticus 26. Multiple times in that chapter, God states that if the nation will not listen after a period of discipline, then there will be a further extended period of discipline that is multiplied sevenfold. Then if you walk contrary to me and will not listen to me, I will continue striking you sevenfold for your sins. Leviticus 26:21. The remaining portion of the 430 years would be multiplied by 7 before their entire time of judgment would be over. So let's walk through this in detail. God started a period of 70 years of judgment against the Jewish nation and all the surrounding nations in 609 BC, when Babylon became the dominant power in the region of the world. This would end in 539 BC, when the Babylonian Empire was conquered by the Medes and Persians. However, Jehoiakim and the population rebelled against this required punishment after only 7 years. But God was adamant that they must drink of it. God stated through Jeremiah that if they would not submit, additional punishment would be added. God shows them through Ezekiel's object lesson that at that point there was an additional 430 years added to their allotted time of punishment. So now both the initial 70 years and the 430 years clocks tick down until the 70 years are over. At that point, there are 367 years remaining of that 430 years. However, during that time, Zedekiah and the rest of the population still did not submit to God's punishment. God sent Babylon to utterly destroy Jerusalem and the temple and cart off the majority of the population into the Babylonian region. In addition, God multiplied that remaining period of punishment sevenfold until the time of punishment would be over. So that remaining 367 years is multiplied by 7, and the time period increased to 2,569 years of punishment. The initial period of 70 years of punishment ended in 539 BC. The next year was the start of the further 2,569 years of punishment. That means 538 BC plus 2,569 further years ends in 2032 AD. Note that there is no year 0 BC or 0 AD. So 2032 AD is the year that the period of the punishment dictated by God for the Jewish people ends. Isn't this amazing? Both the 70 weeks spoken of by Gabriel and the 430 days of Ezekiel have possible fulfillment in the very same year. It is intriguing to notice that the starting points of the various judgments from God against Israel cluster around 600 BC. This is an observation that has not been noticed by most scholars of the prophetic. Most concentrate on the termination of the 70 years ending at the fall of Babylon, and falsely assume significant starting dates after that point. However, arguably, one of the most significant events in the history of the Jewish people until that point occurred when God removed himself from dwelling in his own temple. He had been living in the midst of his chosen people since the time of the Exodus, for many centuries. This was first as a pillar of fire and smoke, then associated with the Ark of the Covenant, and then finally inside the temple. It is very significant that the prophecy of Ezekiel's 430 years occurred right at this point. Gabriel also indicated that the start of the 70 weeks was set to start during this time. In addition, God uniquely singles out two pagan rulers for this period. Cyrus is described as his anointed, and Nebuchadnezzar is described as his servant. The timelines of both prophecies not only seem to share a similar starting point, but also a similar proposed end date. And here we have two prophets, Daniel and Ezekiel, as two witnesses against the wrongdoing of the Jewish nation. They were each given timelines by God in different ways, but both pointing to the exact same period of time. Ezekiel's 430 days serves as another important layer to add onto the 70 weeks timeline. It corroborates and confirms that the likely year for the end of the time of this punishment is 2032 AD. Again, it must be pointed out that this interpretation of Ezekiel is something that has been newly recognized. After much searching, I have not come across anyone who has ever realized this interpretation before. But as you can see, it is based on an accurate understanding of principles which God has outlined in the Bible over centuries. It is based on a proper understanding of the historical events of the time period and the prophetic material that God wanted to be made known. It also makes it very evident that those people who concentrate on Ezekiel's 430 days without taking into account the full context will never come to a proper understanding and interpretation. That is why there are so many weird and outlandish suggestions that have been put forward for centuries. God's word interprets itself, and it is all intricately connected and self-verifying. But there is much diligent study required. If you have not gotten a grasp of everything in this presentation, please know that all the groundwork was laid out in my previous presentations. It is all related. It depends on a proper understanding of the accurate Jewish calendar, of the original languages that the Bible was written in, and by considering the prophetic material in its historical context when it was given. I invite you to go back to my previous presentations for review. There is yet one more presentation related to the 70 weeks prophecy. There are some other very mysterious sounding numbers that Daniel writes about. Again, people have come up with many strange interpretations, but as I'll show, a proper understanding of their context will lead to some very surprising connections and more confirmation that what has been presented is actually the correct interpretation of these prophecies. Hope to see you back soon.